Hi, I'm Dr. Laurel Geise, and I wanted to spend some time talking a little bit about my background. Would that be okay with you? Yes? Okay, thanks. So I have been a business executive for 30 years. I worked for Fortune 500 companies. Ultimately, the last 10 years of my career, I held positions as a Chief Information Security Officer and Chief Compliance Officer, managing global programs around the world. My background is in psychology. I have undergraduate degrees in psychology and information technology. I have a master's degree in business, and I also have a doctorate of ministry. So how does all of that come together, right? Would it be okay if I shared a personal story with you? Yes? So, my journey actually began when I got out of college, and I started working at a bank. And I was actually in Buffalo, New York, working for M&T Bank, and I was a programmer. And as I started to raise up through the ranks at the bank, one of the things that I learned was that I needed to invest in myself to actually learn more about business. So I made the decision to invest in myself and go back to school at night. So while I was working at the bank as a computer programmer, I was also going to school at night to get my MBA. So that took 4 years. And during that time frame, I met Bob, who is the love of my life. And we had such a great life together. And we had an opportunity to move to Cincinnati, Ohio. So we moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, where I worked at Fifth Third Bank, downtown for those in Fountain Plaza, for those of you who live around Cincinnati. And then we actually had the opportunity to move to Dallas, Texas. So we're living in Dallas, Texas. We were actually very new to Dallas. And one of the things that we used to love to do was to go to concerts. And in fact, there was a concert at Texas Stadium. It was the Eagles concert, for those of you Eagles fans. And this was the Hell Freezes Over tour. Now, if you're old enough to remember this, the Eagles had broken up like in the late 70s, early 80s, and they said they would never get back together until hell froze over. And guess what? Hell had frozen over, and they were on tour, and they were going to be at Texas Stadium. So Bob and I were getting ready to go to the concert, and we were getting ready to tailgate. How many of you tailgate before a concert, right? Yes, fantastic. So we're getting ready, and I remember he said to me, he said, "Honey, I don't feel well." And I was like, "Oh, no, no, no." I said, "We're going to this concert." So I gave him 2 aspirins, and I told him to lay down, and he would feel better. Well, a little while later, he came out of the bedroom, and he said to me, "Honey, I really don't feel well." And I remember turning around, and I could see him. He had his hands over his chest like this. And I just knew he was having a heart attack. So I literally put him in the car and drove him 2 blocks to the hospital. We lived 2 blocks from the Presbyterian Hospital in Dallas. Took him into the emergency room, and the doctors took him behind the doors. And I have to tell you, I was very scared because we were in Dallas. We hadn't lived there very long. Our family wasn't there. I really didn't know a lot of people there, and I really didn't know what was happening to him behind those doors with the doctors. Well, eventually, one of the doctors did come out to speak to me, and I was in the emergency room waiting area, and they told me that Bob had indeed had a heart attack, but the good news was that he had survived, and they were moving him to the cardiac intensive care unit. And I remember running up to that cardiac intensive care unit and found Bob in his room, and I knelt by the bed, and I held his hand, and we both were just crying. We were crying tears of joy. We were so grateful that he had survived the heart attack and that we had many days ahead of us to live together. Well, the next morning, the doctor came in to talk with us, and the doctor says, he says, "I have good news and I have bad news." He says, "The good news is that Bob survived the heart attack with very little damage to his heart. And this is very good news indeed. However," he said, "the bad news is that we found a tumor the size of a baseball in Bob's right lung, and he has lung cancer. and probably has about 6 months to live. Well, despite going to many different doctors, going through surgeries, chemotherapy, radiation, even trial medicines to help him, I'll never forget that moment when I walked into the hospital about 6 months later. And I remember seeing Bob's doctor outside the door of his room, and she told me that he had slipped into a coma and he only had a few hours to live. And at that moment, I could really smell that antiseptic smell that we have in the hospital. And I remember walking into his room and I could hear the machines beeping, the machines that were monitoring him. And I could see him laying in the bed and his eyes were closed. And as I approached the bed, I remember I could taste that acid coming up in the back of my throat. And as I knelt down to be with him, I remember holding his hand. And it was the only time that he didn't hold my hand back. And after Bob died, I went into a really deep depression. I couldn't understand how the man that I loved could be gone so quickly and that all of our plans had just turned to dust. And this depression went on for over a year until I actually found myself laying on the bathroom floor crying one night. I was literally crying out to God for help because I needed help. I didn't think I could keep going on. And as I was laying there on the floor, I heard a word, and the word was meditation. And I remember sitting up and saying, "What?" And I heard the word again, meditation. Well, I was a business executive at the time. I didn't even know what meditation was, but through a series of synchronistic events, I met Dr. Deepak Chopra, who's the world's leading meditation instructor, and I studied with him. And I learned meditation. And when I did, it helped me to heal emotionally as well as physically and spiritually. And it changed my life so much that I became a meditation instructor. And for the last 20 years, I have been teaching meditation and mindfulness courses on the weekends, particularly helping people who in their families have someone who may be facing a terminal illness. And this has been a passion of mine for over 20 years. Well, I continued with my career in corporate America and I was very successful. And after 30 years, I decided that it was time to give back more. I felt that I had a bigger reason. And my bigger reason was to bring mindfulness practices into the workplace. So I founded the Geise Group in 2013, which is a company that's dedicated to bringing mindfulness programs into organizations. And we've worked with companies from Fortune 50s to Inc. 5000s to startups to every industry you can think of across the United States. And we love this work. I love bringing mindfulness programs into organizations. It's my bigger purpose.